At 58 years old, I let a man half my age, homeless, broken into my bed, believing I was saving him. But in truth, he was the one holding the gun, and I was the one who became the prisoner. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 81 years old now. To folks here in Willow Creek, Kansas, I'm just the quiet widow at the end of the gravel lane. They know me as the woman with flour, always dust in her hands, after mornings of bacon. The one with silver hair tied back in a plain, sensible bun. I'm the neighbor who never says no when you knock, asking for a cup of sugar or a slice of warm pie. But what they don't know, what I've never told another living soul, is that 23 years ago, my loneliness nearly got me killed. I never told my children, who live scattered across busy cities. Never confessed to Pastor Daniels, who's heard every other sin I dared to speak aloud. Not even to God in those desperate midnight prayers, when I begged for peace. But tonight, sitting here on this creaky old porch, watching the wheat bend and sway in the Kansas breeze, I know some stories are too heavy to carry to the grave. The shame of what I did, bringing that stranger into my home, into my bed, has eaten at me like rust. And the terror of what he did afterward, that's what kept me waking up, screaming year after year. So maybe it's time you heard the truth. Maybe it's time someone understood what loneliness can drive a woman to do, and what evil looks like when it wears the face of someone you're trying to save. So go on, fix yourself a glass of sweet tea, or maybe a cup of coffee, depending where you are. And before I go any further, tell me this. Where are you watching from tonight? Is it morning where you are, or deep in the quiet hours past midnight? Because what I'm about to share, it will chill you to the bone. You see, loneliness doesn't strike like a storm. It creeps. It settles over you like frost on a window pane. Slow, quiet, until one morning you wake, and the world outside is nothing but blurred glass. When my husband William passed in the spring of '99, I thought I knew what it meant to be alone. I was wrong. Dead wrong. William and I built a life the steady way you lay bricks, one on top of another, solid sure. 42 years of marriage, and then suddenly I was rattling around our 3-bedroom home like a marble rolling inside a tin can. The silence pressed down so heavy, I swear I could taste it. My children, bless them, had their own lives. My daughter Emily buried in her law practice up in Chicago. My son David raising twins out in Colorado. They called on Sundays, mailed cards on holidays. But none of that filled the empty rooms, the endless quiet. And Willow Creek, it isn't a big place. Barely 15,000 souls. Most good church-going folk who keep their noses clean. We've got our main street, with the old courthouse and the diner, where everyone knows your order, and the Baptist church, where 3 generations of my family sat in the same pew. Summers here are so hot. The asphalt shimmers like a mirage, and folks linger inside the grocery store just to savor the air conditioning. But in a town this small, a widow can vanish into the background without anyone really noticing. I started talking to William's photograph on the mantel, asking him what he thought of the weather, or the neighbors, or whether I should plant tomatoes that spring. Sad maybe, But at least it was a voice in the house, even if it was only my own bouncing back. And that's when I began to notice him. He sat on the iron bench in the church square every Wednesday when I went to the farmer's market. A young man couldn't have been more than 32, maybe 33. His clothes were threadbare, worn thinned as old paper. His hair looked like he'd hacked at it himself with kitchen scissors. But his eyes, Lord, his eyes, they carried a sorrow that reminded me of a dog kicked too many times, still clinging to the hope of kindness. The first times I saw him, I just nodded polite, as any lady would, and went on with my errands. That's what proper women do acknowledge, but don't get involved. But something in him tugged at me. Maybe it was the way he sat, like he was trying not to take up more space in the world than he deserved. Maybe it was how he'd tip an imaginary hat when older women passed by, like some remnant of manners taught long ago. Week after week, there he was. Rain or shine, that man was planted on that bench. And before I knew it, I was packing an extra sandwich from home. Just in case, I told myself. Just Christian kindness. But looking back now, I realize that was the first step into the darkest chapter of my life. When October came and the nights turned sharp with cold, I found myself lying awake, wondering where that young man disappeared to when the sun went down. The ladies at church had already started whispering. Mrs. Thornton swore he must be on drugs. Deacon Harris's wife was convinced he was casing houses to rob. But Mia watched him, really watched him. And all I saw was someone who'd lost his way. There's a difference between dangerous and desperate, and I believed I could tell which one he was. That's when I started bringing him sandwiches, regular as clockwork. Nothing fancy, just food to fill an empty belly. We began exchanging a few words each time. His name was Michael. He told me he'd been traveling looking for work. His voice was soft, educated, even like he'd once had schooling before life shoved him onto that bench beneath the old oak tree. He always thanked me proper, called me Mom, and never once asked for more than what I freely gave. But here's the truth. Loneliness makes fools of us all. And I was about to become the biggest fool in Willow Creek. The mistake I made was thinking I could save someone who didn't want saving. What I didn't understand then was this: sometimes the person you try to rescue is already hunting for prey. And kindness? Kindness can be the bait that leads you straight into a trap you never saw coming. I remember the first time I set that sandwich in his hands. Ham and cheese on plain white bread. My fingers shook like autumn leaves. He looked up with eyes the color of storm clouds, and something inside me shifted. It was like a door I'd kept locked tight, creaked open, just a sliver. He smelled of October rain and clothes that hadn't been washed in too long, but beneath it was a faint trace of soap, like he'd found a place to clean himself up. When his fingers brushed mine as he took the food, I was startled by how soft they were. Not the rough, calloused hands of a man used to heavy labor. That should have been my first warning sign. But loneliness blinds you. It makes you ignore the details that don't fit the story you want to believe. At first, our conversations were small. He spoke of months on the road, of losing a factory job back east of nights, spent sleeping wherever he could. His voice had a gentleness that reminded me of my William, back when he'd soothe me after one of my mother's cruel tirades. Michael asked me about my day, about the weather, even about whether my tomatoes had survived the frost. Simple questions, yes, but they were the first real conversations I'd had in months that weren't with a grocery clerk or a telemarketer, and I found myself looking forward to Wednesdays with an anticipation that felt almost sinful. I'd wake up planning the sandwich, hoping he'd still be waiting on that bench. I'd even linger at my mirror, checking whether my silver hair was sitting just right, if the lines around my eyes looked deeper than yesterday. Foolishness for a woman nearing 60. But grief and loneliness make you feel like you're fading. His attention made me feel seen again. By November, we spoke longer. He told me stories about cities I'd never set foot in, described sunsets over mountain ranges I'd only seen in magazines. I began bringing coffee in a thermos, and we'd sit together while the Kansas wind carried the smell of cut wheat and changing seasons. He never asked for money, never demanded more than what I offered. That restraint made me trust him more than I should have. Then came the day everything changed. I found him shivering so violently, his teeth rattled like castanets. November had turned cruel overnight. Frost clung to the courthouse steps, though it was barely past 4 in the afternoon. His lips were tinged blue, his whole body radiating cold through the thin jacket on his back. When I laid a hand on his shoulder and felt that bone-deep chill, the words slipped from my lips before I even thought them through. Come with me, just for a little while. You can warm up at my house, and right there, that's where the line between kindness and danger blurred forever. But before I go further, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Is autumn turning cold where you are, or is it warm where you live? Do you know that ache of nights when the silence feels louder than the wind? Because that's the place I was in the night I invited Michael across my doorstep. That night, as I lay in my empty bed, I could hear him moving quietly downstairs. The sound of his footsteps, the clink of dishes being put away, it wrapped around me like a lullaby. I kept picturing his hands holding my best china, the care with which he dried each plate, as though he understood that if it mattered to me, it mattered to him too. And then, against my better judgment, I began to imagine. I imagined what it would be like to no longer wake to silence, to pour 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, to have someone to share the newspaper with, to feel warmth beside me in the Kansas winter nights. The next morning, when the wind howled around the corners of the house, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and hardly recognized myself. My cheeks had a blush of color I hadn't seen in months. My eyes looked brighter, almost alive again. I began reaching for my nicer house dresses, the ones William always said brought out the blue in my eyes. I was acting like a woman with hope. And that realization frightened me more than I dared admit. The moment of no return came one evening when I stepped into the living room and found Michael seated on my couch, holding the photograph from William's and my 25th anniversary. He wasn't looking at it idly. His gaze was fixed, unreadable. Not quite jealousy, but something sharper, like he was measuring himself against the man who had loved me for 40 years. When he noticed me standing there, he didn't set the picture down in embarrassment. He smiled. His storm-grey eyes met mine, and in that soft, deliberate voice he said, "William looked like a good man, a lucky man. To have had you for so long, the way he spoke, it felt less like a compliment and more like a question I wasn't ready to answer. And that night, for the first time since William's death, I didn't cry myself to sleep. Instead, I lay awake thinking of tomorrow, of next week, of whether Michael might still be here at Christmas, maybe longer. I was weaving a future with a man whose last name I didn't even know. A man I had known for barely 2 weeks. A man who could vanish as quickly as he'd appeared. I should have remembered the old saying, when something feels too good to be true. It usually is. But when you've been starving for hope, you'll swallow poison and call it honey. The shift came one Saturday evening in late November. I remember it clearly because earlier that day at the Piggly Wiggly, Mrs. Henderson from down the street had stopped me. With that sharp-edged curiosity small towns are famous for, she asked about the young man she'd seen in my yard, her tone balanced on the thin line between polite interest and judgment. I found myself getting defensive, insisting it was only temporary, only Christian charity. But as I pushed my cart through the aisles, I caught myself buying things I hadn't bought in years. Thick steaks instead of ground beef. Fresh bakery bread instead of the day-old loaves. Even a bottle of red wine I pretended was for cooking, though I knew better. I was shopping like a woman expecting company. Like a woman who wanted to impress someone. The realization brought a flush to my cheeks, half shame, half anticipation. When I returned home, Michael was waiting on the porch. He had cleaned up more than usual, his dark hair combed neatly back, and on his frame, a crisp shirt that wasn't William's, though I told myself it was. The November sun was sinking low shadows, stretching long, and for a fleeting moment, he looked like something out of a dream. Like an answer to prayers I'd been too afraid to pray. He helped me carry in the groceries, and when his eyes landed on the steaks, his whole face lit up. "It's been months since I've had a proper meal," he said. The gratitude in his tone made me feel as though I were giving him a gift far greater than just dinner. We worked side by side in the kitchen. He washed the vegetables. I seasoned the meat. The air between us felt warmer than the oven glowing behind me. But even now, looking back, I can't help but wonder, was it real gratitude I saw in his eyes? Or was it the first glimpse of the trap quietly closing around me? And let me pause to ask you, do you believe in instincts? That little voice that whispers when something feels off. Did you ever ignore it, only to regret it later? Because that night, I ignored mine. It felt natural. So natural, so easy, like we'd been moving in step for years instead of weeks. Over dinner, Michael spoke of things he hadn't shared before. A childhood cut short by loss. A mother gone too young, a father who drowned his grief at the bottom of a bottle until it killed him too. He told me he'd once started college, had dreams of something more, but life had shoved him off course. Since then, he'd been drifting from one town to another, searching for somewhere, someone to belong to. The wine softened his voice, made it almost tender. And when he reached across the table to touch my hand, I didn't pull away. After dinner, we sat together on the couch, the late-night movie flickering across the screen. Slowly, almost without noticing, the space between us grew smaller. There was no single moment I could point to and say, that's when it happened. Just a series of little things. His shoulder brushing mine, his fingers grazing my arm when he reached for his cup. Small touches, innocent touches, but each one lit a spark I hadn't felt in decades. When the movie ended, we lingered in the blue glow of the television, neither of us speaking, both knowing something was shifting between us. The silence stretched like a bridge I was terrified to cross. Then Michael turned toward me. His storm-gray eyes held mine, and he spoke my name so softly it was almost a whisper. I want to say I don't remember choosing, that it just happened. But that would be another lie, because in that moment I had a choice. I could have stopped it. I could have remembered that I was a 60-year-old widow and he was a man young enough to be my son. I could have said no. Instead, when his hand rose to my cheek, when his lips brushed mine like a question I answered, I kissed him back. What followed was like falling down a dark well. Terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly beyond my control. Even now, 23 years later, I remember every detail of that night. His hand trembled when it touched me, as if I was something fragile he might break. He whispered that I was beautiful, that I was saving his life, that no one had ever shown him such kindness. We moved through my house like dreamers, past photographs of William and me, our anniversaries, our children upstairs, into the bed, where I had slept alone for so long. It wasn't beautiful like the movies. It wasn't polished or perfect. We were both too desperate, too hungry for connection, too aware of how wrong it was and how right it felt in the same breath. But afterward, lying in my bed, with Michael's arm draped around me, listening to his steady breathing beside me, I felt something I thought had died with William. I felt wanted, needed, alive in a way that had nothing to do with duty or decency. The guilt came later. Of course it did. When I woke and saw Michael in William's place, his dark hair on the pillow that still carried the faint scent of my husband's aftershave, the shame struck me like a physical blow. What kind of woman was I? What kind of Christian? What kind of wife? Even a widowed one. But then Michael opened his eyes. He smiled at me with such warmth, such gratitude that the guilt was buried beneath something stronger. The intoxicating thrill of being desired again. That morning over breakfast, the air in the house itself felt changed, charged with possibility. Michael spoke of staying through Christmas, maybe longer if I'd have him. He talked about finding work in town, about making this arrangement more permanent, and I found myself nodding along, like a woman who believed she had just glimpsed her future, not realizing I was already caught in the oldest trap of all. Because I wasn't his savior, I was his mark, and the trap was already closing around me. The first week after that November night passed like a fever dream. Ethan moved his few possessions from the living room into my bedroom, and suddenly my house no longer felt like mine. It felt like it belonged to someone younger, Someone who hadn't spent the past 2 years talking to photographs and eating dinner alone. I caught myself humming while I cooked breakfast. I wore lipstick to the grocery store. I started caring about little things I'd stopped caring about when Richard died. But small towns have eyes everywhere. And it didn't take long for those eyes to notice. Mrs. Whitaker from across the street suddenly found endless excuses to work in her front garden whenever Ethan was outside. The mailman lingered on my porch longer than he should, talking about the weather, while his gaze drifted toward the doorway. And the Piggly Wiggly conversations stopped when I walked down the aisle, then picked up in whispers the moment I passed. I told myself I didn't care what people thought. I was a grown woman, a widow entitled to companionship if I could find it. But the weight of their watching, their judging, their whispers at the post office, and the diner pressed down on me like stones on my chest. This was the kind of town where reputation mattered, where what people thought of you determined whether you were invited to church socials or quietly pushed out of the community you'd called home for 40 years. Ethan seemed oblivious to it. Or maybe he just didn't care. He had started answering my phone when I was busy introducing himself, with an authority that made him sound like he belonged there. When my daughter Anna called from Topeka, he chatted with her for 15 minutes before handing me the phone. I could hear the confusion in her voice when she asked who that nice young man was. The lies came too easily. I told Anna he was a distant cousin, down on his luck, helping out around the house. I told the ladies at church he was a handyman I'd hired for the winter. I told myself these weren't lies, just adjustments to a truth people wouldn't understand. But each one burned bitter in my mouth, and slowly I began to realize the life I was building with Ethan demanded a version of me I'd never been before, a woman who lied, who hid things, who lived in shadows. The change in Ethan was subtle at first. So gradual, I almost missed it. The gratitude in his eyes faded, replaced by expectation. He stopped asking before using my car, or taking the last piece of pie, or switching the television channel while I was watching. Small things harmless on their own, but together they formed a pattern that unsettled me. One December morning, I found him at Richard's old desk, sifting through bank statements and insurance documents with the focus of a man on business. When I asked what he was doing, he only smiled, that soft, practiced smile, and said he was just trying to understand my financial situation so he could help me make better decisions. The way he said it, so calm, so reasonable, made me feel foolish for questioning him. But something cold lodged in my stomach that had nothing to do with the winter weather. That evening, while we sat in the flicker of the TV, Ethan mentioned casually that my house was worth more than I probably realized. He talked about how a woman my age shouldn't have to worry about maintaining such a big place. How there were nice apartments in town that would be more manageable. He made it sound like concern. But the weight of his hand on my arm felt different now. Possessive, not protective. And once I started noticing, I couldn't stop. The calculating way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. The ease with which he made decisions for me, speaking over me when visitors came. The way he had begun quietly to claim pieces of my life as his own. I pushed these observations down, buried them under the fear of being alone again. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Ethan wasn't the grateful, gentle man I thought I'd rescued from that church bench. He was something else entirely. And I was just beginning to understand what I'd really let into my home. Christmas of 1999 should have been the loneliest of my life. Instead, it became the most terrifying. The weeks slipped by, and before I realized it, Michael had been living in my house for over a month. What began as a simple act of kindness, bringing home a lonely man in need, was slowly transforming into something darker. I hadn't yet found the courage to name it, but looking back, I see it for what it was. Captivity creeping in like a shadow I refused to acknowledge. It happened so subtly, so gradually, that I couldn't point to the exact moment when the grateful gentleman I'd first met disappeared. In his place was someone else, someone entitled, someone claiming pieces of my life as if they'd always belonged to him. Michael began spreading his belongings across Walter's dresser, cluttering the space where my late husband's pocket watch and reading glasses once rested. That alone unsettled me. But what truly chilled me was the day I found him wearing Walter's clothes. Shirts too tight across his chest, trousers hanging awkwardly, like he was trying to slip into another man's life. My man's life. When I told him it made me uncomfortable, he only looked at me with those stormy eyes and said softly, "I thought you'd want me to feel at home. Don't you want that for me?" And when I didn't answer fast enough, he let guilt wash over me like a tide. That became his weapon, the guilt. Every time I questioned his choices, every time I admitted I was uneasy, Michael reminded me of how empty I'd been before him. He would touch my cheek so tenderly and whisper, "Do you want to go back to that life alone with photographs? Eating meals by yourself, talking into the silence?" Friends, let me pause here. Tell me, have you ever let someone into your life only to realize, much later, that they were slowly rewriting the rules of your existence? Write to me in the comments. I want to hear from you. The truth was, his words cut deep because they were true. The loneliness had been devouring me for years, and as frightening as Michael's growing presence was, it still felt better than the suffocating silence that had nearly destroyed me after Walter's death. So I stayed quiet. I swallowed my protests. I told myself compromise was part of companionship, that maybe this was how love, or something like love, worked when you were older. I convinced myself I was too sensitive, too fragile, too ungrateful. But then came December. At the bank one chilly morning, I opened my passbook and froze. Withdrawals. Small but noticeable. $50 here, $100 there. I lived on a fixed income. Every dollar mattered. When I confronted Michael, he didn't even deny it. Instead, he smiled, as if explaining something simple to a child. He said he'd only wanted some cash for Christmas shopping to surprise me with gifts. He said he thought I wouldn't mind. After all, we shared everything else. His reasoning sounded almost reasonable. So reasonable that, for a moment, I questioned myself. Was I being selfish? He shared my bed, my meals, my home, why not my money too? But underneath his calm tone was something that chilled me. more than the Kansas winter, the fact that he had done it without asking, that somehow he'd gained access to my accounts. From then on, I began noticing his belongings in places they didn't belong. My jewelry box, once neat and untouched, now bore the signs of having been rifled through. At first, nothing seemed to be missing, but the very act of intrusion was enough to make my skin crawl. And yet I stayed silent, because silence, I told myself, was better than the alternative being alone again. By then, Ethan had been living in my house for over a month. From what had started as an act of kindness, a rescue really had turned into something else, something I now realize was captivity. At the time, though, I couldn't bring myself to call it that. The change had been so subtle, so gradual, that I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when the grateful, gentle man I'd taken in disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed to believe he had a right to everything I owned, everything I was. It was like watching a photograph develop in reverse. Instead of fading, Ethan was sharpening, becoming clearer with every passing day. And the picture I saw wasn't one I wanted to see. He'd taken over Michael's side of the bed completely. His few possessions now scattered across the dresser, where my husband's reading glasses and old pocket watch used to sit. And worse, he'd begun wearing Michael's clothes. Shirts far too small for him, stretched tight across his broad chest. It was as though he was putting on a costume, slipping into the life of the man I'd loved and lost. When I mentioned it made me uncomfortable, he fixed me with those storm-gray eyes and said softly, "I thought you wanted me to feel at home. It hurts me when you act like I don't belong here." The guilt was sharp, precise, like a scalpel in skilled hands. Every time I dared to question him, every time I hinted that things were moving too quickly, he would remind me of the emptiness I'd lived with before he came. He'd cup my cheek and whisper, "Do you really want to go back to being that lonely woman? Talking to photographs, eating every meal alone, lying awake at night with nothing but silence to keep you company." And the awful truth was I didn't. That silence had been suffocating me, draining the life out of me day by day. And even this uncomfortable version of Ethan was still better than that unbearable emptiness. So I swallowed my unease. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that maybe this was what compromise looked like when you tried to start over at my age. The money was the first undeniable warning sign. It was mid-December when I went to the bank to make my usual deposit, only to learn that withdrawals had been made from my account. Not large sums, $50 here, $100 there, but enough that I noticed. Enough to matter when you're living on a fixed income. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. Instead, in that calm, reasonable tone that had become his weapon of choice, he explained that he had only wanted to buy Christmas gifts for me. That he thought it would be a surprise. That since we were sharing everything else, he assumed I wouldn't mind. And the logic, at least on the surface, sounded convincing enough that I found myself doubting my own instincts. After all, we were living like a couple. Wasn't it natural to share resources? Wasn't I being selfish, clinging to money when he was giving me so much of himself? But still, the fact that he'd taken without asking, the fact that he had somehow gotten access to my account, that left me feeling exposed, violated in ways I couldn't fully articulate. And that's when I started noticing other things. My jewelry box had been opened. The spare key to my safe deposit box, hidden away in an old coffee can in the pantry, had been moved. Papers in Michael's desk were in a different order than I had left them. Ethan wasn't just living in my house. He was studying me. Studying my life the way a student prepares for an exam, learning everything there was to know about my finances, my possessions, my weaknesses, and even the intimacy between us had changed. It wasn't about closeness anymore. It was about control. His hands on my shoulders, guiding me where he wanted me to go. His arm locked around my waist when we spoke with neighbors, holding me in place. His fingers threading through my hair as he announced our evening plans, without so much as asking what I wanted. I felt less like a partner and more like a doll posed, maneuvered, owned. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve. I'd invited my neighbor, Mrs. Novak, for coffee and cookies. It was a tradition Michael and I had kept for 15 years. She was 84, a kind Polish woman whose husband had passed the same year as mine. Our weekly visits were one of my last fragile links to a world outside my grief. Ethan was charm itself when she arrived, helping her with her coat, complimenting her cookies, asking about her grandchildren with warm interest. But I saw the way her eyes flicked between us, confusion clouding her expression. And when she asked quite directly how long Ethan had been staying with me, he spoke before I could open my mouth. He spun an elaborate tale claiming to be my late sister's stepson, visiting from Michigan to help me through the holidays. The lie was so smooth, so effortless, it sent a shiver through me, because I never had a sister. Michael was an only child, and so was I. And Mrs. Novak knew that. She had known my family for decades. I watched her face change as the realization hit Ethan was lying as easily as breathing. She didn't confront him. Instead, she looked at me with something like pity, or maybe fear. And in that moment, I understood she saw what I was still refusing to see. After she left, Ethan was coldly furious. Not shouting, never that. He was too clever. But his questions were like blades. Why had I invited someone without asking him? Why was I exposing our business to people who wouldn't understand? Why was I making things complicated when he was only trying to make them simple? His voice never rose, but his hands gripped my arms hard enough to leave bruises. And for the first time since he had moved in, I felt the raw edge of fear. Real fear of what might happen if I said no to him. That night, lying in bed beside him, listening to his slow, steady breathing, I finally admitted the truth I had been running from. I wasn't sharing my life with Ethan. He was taking it piece by piece. And I was too ashamed of my own loneliness, my own desperation to stop him. The new millennium 2000 arrived with a bitter cold snap that froze more than just the Kansas landscape. It froze something inside me too, something that had been dying since Christmas Eve. January was brutal. Ice storms that snapped power lines, winds that sliced through coats like knives. And Ethan used the weather as another argument for why I needed him. A woman your age can't live alone in such a big house during storms like these. It's dangerous, but the danger wasn't outside my walls anymore. It was inside, eating at my table every morning, sleeping in my bed. every night, slowly erasing the woman I had been for 60 years. Ethan stopped pretending to look for work. Whenever I brought it up, he'd dismiss it with a wave. Nobody's hiring in the dead of winter. I'm better off focusing on taking care of you. But what he called taking care felt like taking over. He reorganized my kitchen to suit himself, moved furniture without asking, threw away Michael's belongings, claiming it wasn't healthy for me to live in a shrine to the past. And the worst part, he made everything sound reasonable. When I said I liked my kitchen the way it had been for 40 years, he'd insist his way was more efficient. When I wept over the loss of Michael's favorite coffee mug, he'd hold me gently and whisper that he was only trying to help me heal. But healing wasn't what was happening. I was being erased. Holding on to painful reminders, Dean often said, was the very thing keeping me chained to grief instead of moving forward. But the way he said our life together sent shivers down my spine. That phrase slipped into his conversations more and more like a decision already made on my behalf. He painted pictures of spring plans, house renovations, maybe even marriage so he could join my insurance, he said. Sometimes he spoke of selling the house and moving somewhere warmer, where winters wouldn't torment an older woman like me. In his mind, these futures were not possibilities. They were certainties. Friends, let me pause here and ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Is it cold where you are? Or are you lucky enough to be in a place with gentle weather? For me back then, Kansas winters were merciless, but the real storm wasn't outside. It was inside my home. My world had become a quiet prison, and I hadn't noticed the bars closing in. Dean answered my phone as if it were his own. When my friend Sarah called from Topeka, he would say I was resting or too busy. When the ladies from church asked about committee meetings or potlucks, he'd gently tell them I preferred quiet nights at home. And the worst part, I stopped fighting it. Each interaction was a maze of lies. Dean had spun stories I had to uphold. Why I looked thinner, why my hands trembled, why I smiled less. No explanation ever rang true. So I withdrew. Staying home was easier than facing eyes that might see what I didn't want to admit. Dean's grip tightened most on my finances. He managed every account, claiming women my age were prime targets for scams. My Social Security check flowed into a joint account he controlled. If I wanted groceries, I had to ask him for money, like a child begging for an allowance. Every request, no matter how small, was scrutinized, questioned. Independence. Once my lifeline was slipping through my fingers, and then came February, a discovery that shattered the last threads of denial I clung to. One afternoon, while Dean chopped firewood outside, I was tidying our bedroom. Lifting his jacket to hang it properly, I noticed it felt unusually heavy. Checking the pocket, my hand closed around something cold metallic. My heart stopped. It was a pistol. Small black, wrapped in an oily cloth that reeked of steel and menace. I'd never touched a gun in my life, but in that moment, the weight of it was unbearable, like concentrated darkness in my palm. My hands shook violently as I rewrapped it and returned it to the exact spot. But nothing could erase the pounding in my ears, the terror swelling in my chest. Dean had never spoken of a gun, never hinted at needing one. Why hide it? The answer was horrifyingly simple. A weapon concealed from me meant it wasn't for protecting us, it was for controlling me. That night, lying in bed beside him, listening to his calm, steady breathing, I finally accepted what I had invited into my home. For 3 days, I moved through our routine as though nothing had changed. Cooking breakfast, watching TV, enduring his touches. But inside, every glance towards that jacket pocket made my body stiffen like prey, frozen under a predator's shadow. And friends, let me ask you this. If you discovered a hidden weapon in the hands of someone you no longer trusted, what would you do? Would you confront them? Or would you, like me back then, stay silent, living with fear as your constant companion? The knowledge ate at me like acid. I'd wake in the middle of the night and watch Ethan sleeping beside me, wondering what kind of man felt the need to carry a gun while living with a 60-year-old widow in a quiet Kansas town. What was he afraid of? Or worse, who was he planning to use it on? The question circled my mind like vultures, turning every ordinary moment into something charged with danger. I began noticing the things I had tried so hard to ignore. The way Ethan's eyes would go cold when he thought I wasn't looking, shutters slamming closed over windows. The way his jaw tightened when I asked harmless questions about his past, where he came from, why he'd been living on the streets. Even the way he touched me had shifted, no longer affectionate, but proprietary, as if I was something he owned. All the red flags I'd once been too lonely, too desperate to see, now blazed in front of me. But what terrified me most was realizing how trapped I had become. Ethan controlled my money, my phone calls, even my social connections. He had quietly and systematically isolated me from everyone who might have helped. And I had let it happen, because admitting I'd made a terrible mistake, facing the shame and judgment of my community, seemed worse than surrendering pieces of myself. Now I understood what I had mistaken for love was nothing more than a slow, deliberate takeover of my life. The decision to ask him to leave came to me one Thursday morning in late February while I brewed coffee, and Ethan sang in the shower. That casual happiness in his voice felt obscene while I lived in fear. This was my house, my life, my choice, and I'd handed all of it to a man who lied as easily as breathing and carried a hidden gun. I spent the day rehearsing my words, in front of the bathroom mirror, while folding laundry under my breath, while stirring a pot. I would be kind, but firm. I'd explain that the arrangement wasn't working, that I needed space, that it would be better if he found another place. I would even help him pay for a motel, give him bus fare. Charitable, but clear. He had to go. But when the moment came when we sat across from each other at the kitchen table after dinner, the words that left my mouth weren't the ones I had practiced. Instead, I heard myself ask, "Ethan, why do you have a gun?" The change in him was instantaneous. The easy smile drained away, replaced by something so cold, so calculating, I felt as though a stranger had taken his place. He went perfectly still, the way predators do when they're deciding whether to strike. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, stripped of the charm he'd worn for months. He asked how I'd found it. When I explained about moving his jacket, he nodded slowly, as if memorizing my habits, my routines, my tendency to tidy up. Then he looked at me and said, "The gun was for protection." that living on the streets taught a man to be careful, that he'd simply forgotten it was there. But his words felt rehearsed. His eyes studied me, measuring my reaction, calculating. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I had forced him to show me who he really was. And there would be no pretending after this. That night, the gun appeared on the kitchen table. Not brandished, but not hidden either. He placed it there while I washed dishes, setting it down as casually as a fork. When I asked why, he smiled a smile that never touched his eyes and said there was no point hiding it anymore. The message was clear. The rules had changed. I lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, listening to Ethan's breathing beside me. He had keys to my house, access to my bank accounts, knowledge of my daily routines. He had cut me off from friends and family, so gradually I could no longer remember how. And now his gun sat in the center of my home like a silent threat. But somewhere in that darkest night, a spark of the woman I used to be flickered back to life. I wasn't dead yet. I had survived 60 years without Ethan, including 2 years of widowhood that nearly destroyed me. And I could survive this if I found a way out. In the morning, I would start planning my escape. But that night, I lay perfectly still, letting Ethan believe he had already won. Because sometimes the only way to survive a predator is to make him think you're already dead. The end came faster than I expected, and from a direction I never saw coming. It was a Saturday morning in early March, when my grandson Caleb showed up at my front door unannounced, grinning that crooked smile that reminded me so much of his grandfather, and carrying a duffel bag that meant he was planning to stay a while. Caleb was 22 then, a junior at Kansas State, studying agriculture, and he'd driven down from Manhattan with some college friends who were continuing on to Oklahoma for spring break. He'd decided to surprise his old grandma with a visit, maybe help with some projects around the house, catch up on family news over my homemade biscuits and gravy. Sweet boy had no idea he was walking into a nightmare. Ethan handled the surprise about as well as a man with secrets could. He answered the door before I could get there, introducing himself with that same charming smile he'd used on everyone else, explaining that he was helping Mrs. Harris with maintenance work around the house. But I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the quick assessment of this new threat to his carefully constructed situation. Caleb, bless his heart, was too young and trusting to see what I was seeing. He shook Ethan's hand, complimented him on the work he'd done around the yard, made easy conversation about the weather and the drive down from college. But I watched my grandson's face during that first interaction, saw the brief flicker of confusion when Ethan spoke with too much familiarity about my daily routines. When he answered questions about my health and habits like he'd been living here for years instead of months. That first day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. I cooked a big dinner. We sat around the table making conversation, and Ethan played the role of helpful family friend with an Oscar-worthy performance. But the tension was electric crackling under every ordinary moment. Ethan kept touching me, his hand on my shoulder, his arm around my waist, marking his territory in front of Caleb, like a dog marking a fence post. And I could see my grandson starting to notice things. How thin I'd gotten. How jumpy I was around sudden noises. How I kept glancing at Ethan before answering even simple questions. The breaking point came on Sunday night. Ethan had taken my car to drive into town for cigarettes, something he'd started doing more frequently since Caleb arrived. Like he needed time away to plan his next moves. Caleb and I were washing dishes together, and in the quiet of that ordinary moment, my grandson asked the question I'd been dreading. "Grandma, are you okay? You seem different, scared maybe." The concern in his voice, the genuine love and worry, broke something loose inside me that I'd been keeping locked down for months. Before I could stop myself, tears were streaming down my face, and the whole horrible story came pouring out like water through a burst dam. I told him about the loneliness that had made me vulnerable, about Ethan's gradual takeover of my life, about the gun on the kitchen table, and the way I'd become a prisoner in my own home. Caleb listened, without interrupting, his young face growing darker with each revelation, his hands clenched into fists by the time I finished. When I was done, he was quiet for a long moment, then asked to see the gun. We went to the kitchen, and there it was on the table where Ethan left it every night. Now black and ugly and impossible to explain away. That's when Caleb pulled out his cell phone, one of those new things that barely worked half the time, but somehow managed to connect him to 911 that night. He spoke quietly, quickly giving our address, and explaining that his grandmother was being held against her will by an armed man who would be returning soon. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line, to get to a safe place, to stay quiet until help arrived. We turned off all the lights and waited in my bedroom closet like children hiding from monsters. And maybe that's exactly what we were. The end came faster than I ever expected, and from a direction I never imagined. It was a Saturday morning in early March, when my grandson Lucas showed up at my front door unannounced. He was grinning with that crooked smile that reminded me so much of his grandfather. And he was carrying a duffel bag, clear sign he planned to stay a while. Lucas was 22 then, a junior at Kansas State studying agriculture. He'd driven down from Manhattan with some friends who were heading on to Oklahoma for spring break. But he decided to surprise his old grandma instead. Maybe help with a few projects around the house, maybe enjoy some of my biscuits and gravy and catch up on family news. Sweet boy had no idea he was walking straight into a nightmare. Now, family, let me pause for a second. Have you ever had a surprise guest show up at your door? Maybe your child, your grandchild, or even an old friend. How did it make you feel warm inside, or maybe uneasy like I did that day? Tell me in the comments, who was the last surprise visitor you had? When Lucas knocked, Daniel, that's the name he gave me, answered the door before I could get there. He smiled that same polished smile he used on everyone, and introduced himself as a handyman, helping me around the house. But I saw it. The calculation in his eyes. The way he instantly sized up this new threat to his carefully constructed control. Lucas, bless his trusting heart, didn't notice it. He shook Daniel's hand, complimented the work he'd done on the yard, and chatted about the weather and the drive down. But I saw it. That tiny flicker of confusion when Daniel spoke too familiarly about my daily routine, about my health, as though he'd been part of my life for years instead of just months. That day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. I cooked dinner, we sat together at the table, and Daniel played the role of a helpful family friend, like he deserved an Academy Award. But beneath the laughter, there was tension so sharp, you could cut it with a knife. Daniel kept touching me, my shoulder, my ways, little gestures, to mark his territory right in front of Lucas, and slowly I saw the light dawning in my grandson's eyes. He noticed how thin I'd gotten, how jumpy I was at every sound, how I always glanced at Daniel before answering the simplest question. The breaking point came Sunday night. Daniel had gone into town to buy cigarettes, something he'd been doing more often since Lucas arrived. Maybe he needed space to plan his next move. Lucas and I were washing dishes when, in the quiet of that ordinary moment, he asked Grandma, "Are you okay? You seem different. Scared, maybe? Friends watching right now. Has anyone ever asked you that? Has someone ever looked at you so deeply that the truth you'd buried just spilled out?" That's what happened to me. Before I could stop myself, tears were pouring down my face. Months of fear, shame, and silence came crashing out of me, like floodwater breaking through a dam. I told Lucas everything, about my loneliness, about how Daniel had slowly taken over my life, about the gun he kept on the kitchen table. Lucas listened quietly. His young face grew darker with every word, his hands clenched into fists by the time I finished. Then he said softly, "Show me the gun." We walked to the kitchen. There it was, black and heavy, right where Daniel always left it. Lucas pulled out his cell phone, those newer models that only worked half the time, and dialed 911. His voice was steady calm, telling the dispatcher our address, explaining that his grandmother was being held against her will by an armed man. We turned off the lights, slipped into my bedroom closet, and held our breath like children hiding from a monster. And maybe that's exactly what we were. Through the window, we saw headlights sweep across the driveway. Daniel was back, but instead of finding us under his control, he found 3 police cars waiting. They arrested him without a fight. But the look he gave me as they dragged him away, cold enough to freeze the blood in your veins. And then the truth came out. His name wasn't Daniel. It was Marcus Holloway, a man wanted in 3 states for something called romance fraud, targeting lonely older women, moving into their homes, draining their bank accounts, and vanishing. I was supposed to be his 7th victim. But unlike the others, he stayed with me for months. He had copies of my will, my insurance papers, even research on Kansas inheritance laws. He hadn't been planning to leave. He'd been planning to marry me, to isolate me, to wait for me to die, or maybe even speed the process along. Detective Carter told me later, "Mrs. Walker, we believe you were the first woman he wanted to keep permanently. And we don't think he was going to wait for natural causes." Those words still echo in my head 23 years later. The trial was a blur. Other women came forward, widows from Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, all telling the same story. Marcus Holloway got 25 years, and I walked away with my life. But here's the thing, friends. The story doesn't end with me broken. 6 months later, I started volunteering at a senior center. I realized I wasn't alone. So many women my age had been targeted the same way. And 3 years later, I met Harold. a widower, a kind, gentle man who introduced me to his children, who made me laugh, who held me without fear. We had 5 wonderful years before his heart gave out. Those years reminded me what real love feels like. Now at 81, I know this loneliness won't kill you. But the wrong person might. If you take anything from my story tonight, let it be this: it is better to be alone than to be with someone who makes you disappear. Your life has value, your story matters, and it's never too late to begin again. Now let me ask you, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Is it morning, evening? Maybe late at night while you can't sleep? Share with me in the comments, because I want to know just how far this story has traveled. And if these words touched, you don't forget to subscribe, because here on Tin Jova Nuochmat, we remind each other that none of us are ever truly alone.